Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about the history of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy first made its debut in 1942 when physicist Enrico Fermi managed to create the world's first, kind of terrible, nuclear reactor. And it was just a simple pile of uranium bricks, which was able to go to criticality and fuse, but it wasn't very powerful, only around half a watt. And in comparison, it takes around 5 watts to charge a cell phone at normal speed. Back in the days of the 1940s and the early 1950s, even into the 1960s, the main purpose of nuclear reactors was to make plutonium for use in bombs. This was extremely evident when the world's first commercial nuclear power plant opened up in 1956, I think, in the middle of nowhere in Idaho, I think. It's called the Experimental Breeder Reactor 1, and it follows this sort of structure where there is something called a breeder blanket, which is made of uranium 238, and then you have your fuel in here, and then your coolant and the pumps and the heat exchangers and all that other jazz. But what this does is that when the breeder blanket is raised above the fuel assembly will start to fission, and it'll start breaking down, and it'll emit plenty of neutrons, which will go straight through the container and hit the breeder blanket, which will cause the uranium in there to absorb a couple neutrons and become plutonium, which can be used in nuclear weapons. And the fuel itself will breed, which will produce plutonium for use in nuclear weapons. And not all the fuel gets spent, so it can be recycled, and the high-level fission products can be disposed of while leaving the residual uranium behind and able to be used for future products. So nuclear energy was still kind of new in the 1960s and early 1970s, but then something kind of crazy happened. Petroleum started to be more and more common of a energy source for power plants, but then there were a couple wars between Israel and countries and other Arabic countries in the Middle East, and they embargoed plenty of oil to Western countries in exchange for not for forcing Israel to be supported. So, what many countries did, like the US, a bunch of countries, Western countries, they started building lots and lots of nuclear power plants. And indeed, in most countries where there are nuclear power plants, most of them have been built in the 1970s. The closest nuclear power plants to me, the Sequoia Generating Station in Chattanooga, Tennessee, was built in the early 1980s, towards the end of this whole thing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This was also the time when France started rapidly building nuclear power plants, and even the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, that's just called Paluel in northern France. And nowadays, they still produce around 70% of their electricity from nuclear. However, in 1979, I think, there was a mechanical failure and human error at a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania called 3 Mile Island, and it caused a meltdown and evacuation of the surrounding area. No people died, but it still made many people question nuclear power safety, and in Germany, nuclear power plants started to be decommissioned. And eventually, a couple 7 years later, there was human error at a nuclear power plant in the Soviet Union, which caused all of the high pressure water inside to immediately turn to steam, creating a huge explosion and spreading the material of the core over a large area, which caused the permanent evacuation of good tens, hundreds of thousands of people, and around 4,000 people actually died from that incident. It's called Chernobyl. You've probably heard of it before. And after that, nuclear development has basically stagnated. In Germany, nuclear power plants started to be shut down, and nuclear power just was on the decline until the early 2000s when the 9/11 attacks happened and Western countries began to question the sustainability of oil and petroleum products from the Middle East, and nuclear energy began to rise in popularity again, although not many new plants were built because of all of the new regulations, which would increase costs and just make nuclear power less feasible compared to natural gas and other sources. And eventually, in 2011, there was a big tsunami that killed tens of thousands of people in Japan, and a nuclear power plant that was one of the largest nuclear power plants in the world at the time. Um, it was unable to keep its reactors cool, and there were meltdowns and explosions. Not nearly as bad as Chernobyl, though. The surrounding area was evacuated, and only one person died in this incident. And some of these people are starting to return to their homes, and Japan has decommissioned most of its nuclear power plants. However, nuclear energy is experiencing a resurgence. In my home state of Georgia, two nuclear reactors were just brought online, units 3 and 4 of Plant Vogtle in Augusta, or well, just southwest of Augusta, which brought Plant Vogtle up from around 25,000 megawatts to now 45,000, and is now a key supplier of electricity to Georgia and South Carolina, and will be for many decades to come, especially since my nearby, even more close by, Plant Bowen is now undergoing their units are preparing for decommissioning, and many other coal power plants across Georgia are shutting down, and Plant Vogtle will become even more important during those times. And also, a nuclear power plant has just finished construction in the United Arab Emirates called the Barakah nuclear power plant, and is the first nuclear power plant in the Arabian Peninsula. Turkey has just finished constructing a new nuclear power plant made of just small modular reactors, and the United Kingdom is currently constructing a nuclear power plant, Hinkley Point C, uh, which is going through a bunch of economic jargon and is extremely expensive, but as the decal says, will help Britain achieve net zero. And I think the future of nuclear energy is plenty bright. Nuclear energy definitely does have some many advantages over other kinds of ways of producing electricity. Of course, it's basically no CO2 emissions minus the CO2 emissions of the plenty of concrete that's used to construct and all the vehicles used, and the backup diesel generators to an extent. But it's basically nothing when compared to other forms of energy like coal, natural gas, biomass, and oil. And even its disadvantages, like accident prones and nuclear waste, are not too significant because nuclear accidents are extremely rare. And in the long run, nuclear energy is way safer than coal and natural gas because it doesn't produce any sort of pollution and therefore doesn't cause as many deaths per unit of energy in coal and natural gas. And nuclear waste isn't that much of a big deal because very little of it is produced in compared to coal ash from coal power plants, and it's not that hard to store. You can just put it in some big concrete canisters, and then that'll last you at least a century, and then it can just be buried deep below the ground in a deep geological repository and basically be forgotten about. And yeah, that's about it for nuclear energy.